But if you've never taken physics, you can't think about physics. If you've never worked for your people's unity, you can't think about your people's unity. You must understand it properly. Matter of fact, if we understood this in our community, we would stop all the confusion we have. Because usually the ones who are speaking the loudest on how to solve our problems are the ones who've never done anything for the people at all. But you must understand this properly, just as a value. If you're not working for your people's unity, you can't think about your people's unity. So anytime you hear a discussion about how people should be kept together, if you ain't doing nothing, just sit down, shut up. If you say something, say, well, let me tell you the truth. I don't do nothing, so I don't know nothing.
Peace, Black Power. What's the deal? What's happening? What's good? Been a while. Been a minute. But we have some things to discuss. Let's go ahead and get straight to it. What's good? It was good talking. So the point of discussion, or the topic of discussion, I should say, for this live tonight, was today, Monday, December 14th, is to discuss the most recent development with the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19. Dr. Fauci on Friday was giving an interview, and was asked the question about how to build trust and better relations between U.S. medicine and the Black community, Black people, specifically when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine. So there's a few articles that published this interview. The one that I'm going to be reading from is The Hill, thehill.com. And everything that I discuss in this video will be or is available on a document that I put together, of the articles that I cite and whatnot. So if anybody's interested in reading that for themselves, just hit me. So again, Dr. Fauci addresses the concerns of Black people in America as it pertains to the COVID vaccine. So what he says is, I'm going to quote him right now. He says, "The very vaccine that's one of the two that has absolutely exquisite levels, 94 to 95% efficacy against clinical disease and almost 100% efficacy against serious disease that are shown to be clearly safe, that vaccine was actually developed in my institute's Vaccine Research Center by a team of scientists led by Dr. Barney Graham and his close colleague, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, or Kizzy Corbett." Dr. Fauci, again, was giving this interview to CNN, and he goes on to say, so the first thing you might want to say to my African-American brothers and sisters is that the vaccine that you are going to be taking was developed by an African-American woman, and that is just a fact. This is the Moderna vaccine, and not the Pfizer vaccine, in which Dr. Fauci is saying was developed by a team of doctors led by a Black female doctor. So again, that's the primary point that I would like to address in this analysis. And I'm going to be sort of cross analyzing this particular development to the Tuskegee Experiments, the syphilis studies conducted at the Tuskegee Institute during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Over the course of 40 years. That was how long the study, the Tuskegee syphilis study, was conducted, for about 40 years. And it's interesting because Dr. Corbett speaks herself. She's the lead scientist for the National Institute of Health's coronavirus vaccine research. So she's the top authority on this particular matter. And she says trust, especially when it has been stripped from people, has to be rebuilt in a brick by brick fashion. And so what I say to people firstly is that I empathize, and then secondly is that I'm going to do my part in laying those bricks. Hold on to that language that she uses in terms of trust being stripped away and her doing her part in laying the bricks of trust. This language in particular I'm going to be looking at because it does come up as I analyze the Tuskegee experiments themselves. So for those who are unfamiliar, the Tuskegee Experiments, officially known as the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. That's the official title of the study. It began in 1932 at a time when there was no known treatment for syphilis. After being recruited by the promise of free health medical care, 600 black men originally were enrolled in the program. The men were monitored by health workers but only given placebos such as aspirin and mineral supplements, despite the fact that penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis in 1947. So 15 years later from the study officially launching, penicillin becomes the recommended treatment for syphilis. But again, the men who were enrolled into the study, into the program, were not given penicillin. They were not given treatment. Again, a placebo, the medical term is essentially it's a filler. It's a phony. It isn't the actual treatment itself. It's the equivalent of a water pill or a water injection. Yeah, I did my research. Come on, brother, you already know me. In the mid-1960s, a venereal disease investigator in San Francisco named Peter Buxton found out about this study, the Tuskegee Study, and expressed his concerns to his superiors that it was unethical. In response, public health service officials formed a committee to review the study, listen to this, but ultimately opted to continue it with the goal of tracking all participants until all had died. Autopsies were performed and the project data could be analyzed. Again, this is the Public Health Service being made aware of the unethical study that was the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? And then choosing to allow the study to continue, choosing to allow black men to be denied effective treatment of syphilis, which would be penicillin. Again, as the article that I'm citing says, ultimately opted to continue it with the goal of tracking the participants until all had died. Again, one of the goals of this particular analysis that I'm doing is to really concentrate on the very dehumanizing aspects of Western U.S. medicine and healthcare. And so the article goes on to discuss the Tuskegee study. As a result, Peter Buxton leaks the story to a reporter friend who passed it on to another reporter, Gene Heller of the Associated Press. Heller broke the story in July of 1972, prompting public outrage and forcing the study to shut down. The reason why studying the Tuskegee experiments is so critical is because they were shut down in July of 1972, only 48 years ago. My father was born in 1973. So when we study history, when we study the acts of genocide and institutionalized extermination of black people, particularly in the U.S., we need to be clear that we're not studying ancient history or events that occurred centuries ago, such as slavery, such as that peculiar institution, right? They were very real and very recent acts that were perpetrated by this U.S. government and by the institutions of our enemies. So again, the Tuskegee Experiments are a primary example of that very not too far back act of history. So that's a brief overview of the Tuskegee Experiments themselves. Again, the official title of this study is the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. And again, it's intriguing to study the Tuskegee experiments because there's an acute focus on black males, on black men, and we can see how not only does racism play a factor in the complex relationship between black people and U.S. medicine, the anti-black misandry, which is the specific gender nature of pathology and racism, right? Studying how that plays a factor as well in that complex relationship, along with racism, anti-black racism. So on to the main analysis that I'm conducting here. In this article, matter of fact, let me grab it because it's a crucial one, and it's easily one of the most thorough and insightful that I've read in a long time. Neither Victim Nor Villain, Nurse Eunice Rivers, The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment and Public Health Work, written by Susan L. Smith in the Journal of Women's History, 1996. This is, you can find this article on any library database. I'm sure you can Google it and just find a PDF from a university press, or even the Journal of Women's History itself may have an open access section for this article. So this article is the primary source that I'll be engaging in analyzing the complex relationship between black people and U.S. medicine, because again, there's this notion that Dr. Fauci spoke to on just this past Friday, addressing the concerns of black people in America when it comes to the COVID vaccine. He says himself, right, I'll quote him again: "The first thing you might want to say to my African-American brothers and sisters," that's the terminology he used, "is that the vaccine that you're going to be taking was developed by an African-American woman, and that is just a fact." And then that African-American woman herself, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, says herself, "Trust, especially when it has been stripped from people, has to be rebuilt in a brick-by-brick fashion." And so what I say to people firstly is that I empathize, and then secondly is that I'm going to do my part in laying those bricks. Again, hold on to that language that she uses, because as we conduct our analysis of the Tuskegee experiments, and in particular Nurse Eunice Rivers, we'll see the parallels, we'll see the similarities. So we've given an overview of the Tuskegee experiments themselves. What many possibly may not be aware of is that the Tuskegee experiments were quite popular. And when I say popular, I mean popularly supported by black healthcare professionals, by black administrators at the Tuskegee Institute. So let me just read from the article directly. Susan Smith writes, "Black health workers and educators associated with the Tuskegee Institute played a critical role in the experiment. Robert Moten, head of Tuskegee Institute in the 1930s, and Dr. Eugene Dibble, these are two black men, the medical director of Tuskegee's hospital, both lent their endorsement and institutional resources to the government study." So again, we need to be sure that we are being thorough enough in our analysis of acts of history, incidents of history that harm our people. And the reason why I said that is because oftentimes, at least in more recent incidents, black people are at the center, at the helm of those acts. They are more often than not the actors or the agents in carrying out these genocidal logics. The article goes on, "No one was more vital to the experiment than Eunice Rivers, a black public health nurse. Rivers acted as the liaison between the men in the study and the doctors of the United States Public Health Service." So a black woman by the name of Eunice Rivers would be, as Susan Smith writes here, should be considered the most vital piece to the puzzle that is the Tuskegee experiments. And it's critical the analysis that Susan Smith conducts in this article, because she says that the actions of Eunice Rivers can best be understood when set within the context of 20th century public health work. In her capacity as a public health nurse, Rivers acted as the mediator between black clients and the government, implementing health policy at the local level. Indeed, she was the key to maintaining subject interest in the experiment for 40 years. So again, the Tuskegee Experiments lasted for 40 years. Nurse Eunice Rivers is right in the middle. She's that liaison, that bridge between white medicine and white doctors and poor, rural, working class black men who were the participants in this study. So the positionality of Eunice Rivers is very critical. Susan Smith goes on to write. So before I continue, this is a must read. If I'm not being compensated by Susan Smith or by the Journal of Women's History in any way, shape, or form, but this article is a very, very, very thorough and very critical one. So definitely recommended reading. The article goes on. Throughout the early 20th century, the black female nurse was a key figure in spreading the gospel of health and health education to African Americans. Public health nurses were especially important in rural areas where access to doctors was severely limited. So again, positionality, the ways in which identity intersect with institution. Black female nurses, particularly in the public health sector, were very, very critical and very, very very much assets to U.S. white medicine and healthcare, and this is fleshed out further. Again, back to the notion of black people being the endorsers, being the supporters of the Tuskegee Experiments. The article goes on. Black leaders at the Tuskegee Institute endorsed the government study to the relief of federal officials in the belief that it would help the school in its work for African Americans. Dibble, Dr. Eugene Dibble, again the medical director of Tuskegee's hospital, supported the experiment on the grounds that it might demonstrate the costly treatment was unnecessary for people who had latent or third stage syphilis. More importantly, Dr. Dibble urged Robert Moulton, the head of the Tuskegee Institute, to support the study because they, quote, would get credit for this piece of research work, and the study would add greatly to the educational advantages offered our interns and nurses, as well as the added standing it will give the hospital. So there's this dependency that emerges, or that is made apparent to us, the reader. That dependency is on white philanthropy, number one, and number two, governmental aid, or I should say federal funds. The Tuskegee Institute was heavily at this time dependent on white philanthropy and federal funds. So Dr. Eugene Dibble and Robert Moulton see the Tuskegee Experiments as an opportunity to what? Accrue funds and receive philanthropy to support the Tuskegee Institute, which was they were doing great things at the time. But again, we can see how this dependency leads those professionals and administrators to make decisions solely on the potential, the opportunity, the funding that could come as a result, right? So it's important to pay attention to that. Black educators and doctors at Tuskegee envisioned future financial benefits from cooperating with the federal government in the study. Such a belief grew out of Tuskegee's long history of lobbying the federal government for funding and assistance. Again, Dr. Eugene Dibble and Robert Moulton endorsing the Tuskegee Experiments was to them not a roll of the dice or a gamble with black lives, right? Metaphorically speaking, they were making decisions that they had already been making in their administration, right? Under their leadership, they're making decisions, again, as it says here, envisioning future financial benefits for the institute. So we see how that dependency and that lack of autonomy plays into these decisions being made and ultimately negatively impacting the lives of black people, right? And what's so unique about the Tuskegee Experiments themselves is that Susan Smith writes here, it was not a government secret kept hidden from health professionals. It lasted for 40 years and was publicized widely in the black and white medical community without evoking any protest. Again, it took a journalist breaking the story and it making public discourse headlines for there to be any outrage. And even when the outrage came, it wasn't an instant shutdown. Even that took time, right? And what's so interesting, to elaborate further on this unique positionality black healthcare professionals at the time occupied, right? We have to look at class and class consciousness and how this class consciousness or the lack thereof actually contributes to decisions being made by black professionals and black elites at the expense of poor, rural, working class black people. The black men recruited for the Tuskegee Study were not well off, were not middle class, were not professional in any way, shape, or form. They were members of the Tuskegee community, and the Tuskegee community was poor, was rural, was working class. But the decisions being made on their behalf were made by black professionals, black elites, the well-off, doctors, nurses. So again, that positionality and that distance between the two groups is so critical, and we can't overlook that and say, oh, how can Eunice Rivers and Dr. Dibble and Robert Moulton, how can they make such decisions? They're black. Yes, they are. but that a simple race analysis doesn't go far enough or deep enough, I should say. Again, a class analysis is necessary. We have to inject that into our analysis because, again, going back to the original, subject, Dr. Fauci telling black people, "Oh, don't worry, the vaccine was developed by a black woman." He's not just talking out of his rear end to say, "Hey, this should work," right? He's basing that off of the very real historical implications behind identity politics, representation in certain industries and institutions. Nurse Eunice Rivers, because she was black, because she was a woman, a black woman, she was that perfect, as it says, mediator, right, between the male participants in the study and the doctors and the professionals. And we can see how relying on mere race commonality leads to decisions being made haphazardly. The article goes on. Rural African Americans cooperated not out of deference to white doctors, but because they wanted medical attention and treatment for their ailments. And they had come to trust Nurse Rivers as someone who helped them. Even though the government doctors in the study changed over the years, Rivers provided that continuity. Without her assistance, it is doubtful that the experiment would have been able... Oh, it cut off that. It cut off the enemy's tripping. There we go. Without her assistance, her being Nurse Rivers, without her assistance, it is doubtful that the experiment would have been able to continue for so long with such cooperation from the subjects of the experiment. So this trust on the basis of race is exploited by white doctors, by government officials, by the officials of the U.S. Public Health Service, because they recognize, okay, if we inject Nurse Rivers into the equation as a black woman, she can serve as that source of trust and that source of reliance. So again, we can't just, ask ourselves, why would they do that? They're black too. That goes without saying. That's pretty surface level, right? And if I continue, and I'll conclude my analysis of this article with words from Nurse Rivers herself. She says, here we go. When the press exposed the study in 1972, it was confusing and heartbreaking for Rivers to hear the criticism. What bothered her so much was not the plight of the men in the study, so not the deaths of black men at the hands of the U.S. Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Institute. What led her to be so bothered and heartbroken by the outrage at the Tuskegee Experiments, these are her words. the article goes on. As for the men in the experiment, Rivers concluded that they received more, not less, than those around them. These are her words. They didn't get treatment for syphilis, but they got so much more. Those are her words. So again, look at the positionality and the ways that class interact with what's the word? Relations, right? Intraracially, right? So Nurse Rivers, a black woman, is the mediator, the frontline worker, the coordinator of the Tuskegee Experiments, which were genocidal acts perpetrated against masses of black men, right? They were neglected treatment for syphilis for 40 years. And Nurse Rivers, a black woman right in the thick of it, is confused, heartbroken, disturbed at the outrage. She says, but wait a minute, they got all these resources, they got all this treatment. So we see how not only a lack of class consciousness, but even a proximity to whiteness blinds black people from seeing the very real ways in which our people, more often than not, poor and working class, suffer the consequences made or suffer the consequences of the decisions made by, right, black professionals, healthcare workers, all that stuff. The article goes on. She said, what's the topic? Let me see, I got you. Let me see. Matter of fact, let me just pause real quick. For those who are just tuning in, what's the deal? Good to see everybody. The topic is I'm analyzing the comments made by Dr. Fauci during an interview. Dr. Fauci is the, I'm not sure of his position at the CDC, but he was giving an interview to CNN on Friday, just this past Friday, and he was addressing the concerns of the black community domestically as it pertains to the COVID vaccine. And what he said was, let me quote him. The first thing that you want to say to my African American brothers and sisters is that the vaccine that you're going to be taking was developed by an African American woman, and that is just a fact. And then the African American woman herself, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, says herself, trust, especially when it has been stripped from people, has to be rebuilt in a brick by brick fashion. And so what I say to people firstly is that I empathize, and then secondly is that I'm going to do my part in laying those bricks. So that's the topic that I'm talking about. And the reason why I'm studying or analyzing the Tuskegee Experiments in relation to this development is that the Tuskegee Experiments were coordinated and sustained by a black woman, a black female nurse by the name of Nurse Eunice Rivers. And so this article is the primary source that I'm analyzing. And so the article goes on. Rivers and other black professionals shared the dominant vision of scientific research and medical practice and did not consider issues of informed consent or the deadly consequences of such an experiment. Listen to this. Perhaps professionalization and class consciousness blinded them to the high price paid by the poor, rural black men in the study. Black professionals saw this experiment as consistent with their efforts to improve black public health. After public censure forced the halt of the experiment, Rivers declared her innocence in the face of criticism, not on the grounds that she was a victim who was uninformed about the true nature of the experiment, but rather because she insisted she had acted on her convictions. These are her words. These are the words of the black woman who was the nurse, who was the, as this article states, the mediator between white doctors and the black male participants in the study, the brothers who died of syphilis, even though they could have been treated. Over 40 years this happened. She's right in the middle. These are her words. I don't have any regrets. You can't regret doing what you did when you knew you were doing right. I knew from my personal feelings how I felt. I feel I did good in working with the people. I know I didn't mislead anyone. This is a black woman who was the head nurse, the head mediator, the head coordinator of the 40-year-long Tuskegee Experiments, at which hundreds of black men died of a condition that had a known treatment, syphilis. 40 years, this black woman is the mediator, right? At HBCU, on top of that, at the Tuskegee Institute, hundreds of black men perish, and they are studied. And the public health service knows that they're dying and refuses to halt the study, but instead says, no, let the study run its course, let the participants die so we can research and track the data. The black woman at the center of all of that states she does not have any regrets. Questions we need to ask ourselves: does proximity and access to white institutional power, I should say federal institutional power and resources, play a role in the ways in which black people are sort of propelled to the front to occupy the face of something? In this particular case, fast forwarding, Dr. Corbett is being hailed as the hero, the one who led the team to find a COVID vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, right? Dr. Fauci said, a black woman made this, so that's just facts. We have to be able to see the parallels between a Nurse Rivers and a Dr. Corbett, right? And Dr. Corbett said herself, she wants to work to establishing that trust between the black community and medicine as an industry, as an institution. She wants to build that trust. This article talks about how that trust between Nurse Rivers and the black men in the study was exploited, right? The black men continued to participate because they trusted Nurse Rivers. And it's Dr. Corbett, fast forward 60 years later, right? 50 years later, she wants to work on building what? Trust. So questions that we have to ask ourselves are, how does resource coercion, and what I mean by resource coercion is, how does resource coercion, when an institution or a university, in this case the Tuskegee Institute, being deprived of funding, programming, staffing, whatever the particular resource is, being deprived in that fashion, and then relying on philanthropy, government assistance, how does resource coercion contribute to a manufacturing of trust between participants and professionals? Question number one. Question number two, how does the proximity to white colonial institutions lead to distorted and very anti-black perceptions of the conditions and needs of the masses of black people? Nurse Rivers believed she was doing right by the people at the time. And she said it herself, I don't have any regrets. For her to say that, we have to ask the question, how does her proximity, right? How does her proximity to medicine, to the U.S. Public Health Service, how does that contribute to her perception of not doing wrong by the hundreds of black men that died as a result of the Tuskegee Experiments? And then the final question that I ask is, how does the colonial relationship that black people occupy in America, right, as the colonized, how does the colonial relationship between black people, the colonized, and white people, the colonizer, how does this relationship understand trust? How does trust work, right? We have to be clear. The human does not assign or establish trust between the human and the object, right? So as much as we move around and make decisions and live our lives as human beings, right, as black people, we need to be clear that in the eyes of the colonizer, we are not that. We are not human. We are not subject. We are very much object, unhuman, inhuman, right, void of humanity. Therefore, there is no reason for trust, because there's no trust to be had between me and this desk or me and this bookshelf. The bookshelf is an object. So again, the three critical questions. How does resource coercion and dependency on white philanthropy and federal funding contribute, right, to the genocide and institutional extermination, right, perpetrated against black people, oftentimes by black people? What's the relationship between that? Second question is, how does proximity to white colonial institutions actually lead to black people themselves having distorted and anti-black perceptions of the conditions and needs of the masses of black people? And how does trust work in a colonial relationship? So this is not a this is not me, saying, don't take the vaccine, or this isn't an anti-vaccine analysis. This is an analysis of how identity and representation, right, is manipulated and utilized by institutional authorities in order to produce a particular outcome. With the Tuskegee Experiments, the U.S. Public Health Service said, hey, we want to conduct this study of syphilis. How do we get that to happen, right, without causing public outrage or uproar? They said, we can go to the Tuskegee Institute and HBCU. We can recruit black healthcare professionals, nurses and doctors, to carry out this study, and in return, we will give them the resources they so desperately need. That's what happened over the course of 40 years. Fast forwarding to today, the questions we need to ask ourselves, right, are, how is that trust being handled? Is it organic? Is it genuine, right? How does the colonial relationship conceptualize trust? Critical questions to ask ourselves. And again, everything that I shared with you all is available on a document. So if you would like that, just hit me, and I'll send it your way. You can look through it yourself if you're more of a visual learner. So yeah, and then matter of fact, let me show you all images of the individuals that I spoke about, Nurse Rivers, Robert Moulton, and Dr. Dibble. So we have, let me see, turn this. So we have Nurse Rivers, Nurse Eunice Rivers, black woman. We have Robert Moulton, the head of the Tuskegee Institute, and then Dr. Dibble, medical director of Tuskegee Hospital. And again, this is not an indictment of these black folks as being, self-hating, white supremacists in blackface. No, according to this article, they were acting in ways that they believe to be beneficial to black people. So we have to problematize that. We have to really think that and say, okay, these black people really believe they're helping, really believe they're doing something for the benefit of our people. We need to work through that and not just limit our analysis to race. Well, if you black, why, you should help us. It's not thorough enough. How does class come into play? How do resources come into play? How does institution facilitate that exchange? So again, just want to do that real quick, just because, hearing Dr. Fauci say that the vaccine was developed by a black woman was an immediate red flag for myself. But again, it wouldn't have been enough to just say, just because a black woman made it, that don't mean it's good. That's a valid stance to have, but there's no analysis of that. There's no nuance to that position, and we require nuance. We require rigorous examination of our conditions and of our history. So again, if you'd like access to that document, or to this document that I'm referring to and these articles, just hit me. Other than that, stay safe, Africans. These are trying times, testing times, and it's not an easy thing for us to navigate. So I pray that you all are well, and remain well. You and loved ones remain well during these times and during all times, truthfully. So with that, I'll say peace, Black Power. Africa will be free.